1.6. The truth of the results. This section explains how the results of scientific work should be viewed. It is argued that the aim of scientific work is to learn basic and transferable procedures for identifying possible solutions. It is also pointed out that scientists often try to make authoritative statements about truth. But this is questioned by many branches of science. It is argued that it is the job of science to develop methods that are effective for a particular purpose and that these methods can always be replaced by better ones in the future. In research learning, we can apparently really say, everything is relative. For this realization now suggests itself, in scientific work, we do not learn solution steps that are always repeatable in terms of content, but rather we learn fundamentally and thus transferably the procedures for determining possible solutions as such. Previously, Hans-Peter Durr had already made clear with his parable of the fishing net which paradigm determines the sciences. They search for truth and want to make binding statements about it all too readily. This is not only in the nature of the researcher, but often also the result of the expectations of his or her clients. It makes sense to take a closer look at this claim, and to do so quite critically. To this end, we will first talk to the psychotherapist and constructivist Paul Watzlawick and then deal with the requirements of scientific theory that Sir Karl Raimund Popper gave us on the path of scientific work. In the process, we will encounter further paradigms of science with which we need to familiarize ourselves. Outdated views. As early as 1997, Paul Watzlawick told me in an interview at the Mental Research Institute, MRI, in Palo Alto, California, that in his field, psychotherapy, it is still assumed that there is a real reality that the so-called mentally normal, and thus above all the therapists, are aware of. The so-called mentally ill, on the other hand, have a distorted view of this reality. This view has long been overcome in other branches of science and is no longer tenable. In today's epistemology, it is the task of science to develop procedures that are effective for a very specific purpose. Watzlawick concluded. This may well mean that in 5 years' time this present best way of dealing with the problem will already have been superseded by a better one. Watzlawick in Girdler 1997 c. So this epistemological point of view also argues for not striving for general and timelessly valid knowledge, but to concentrate on the concrete and current purpose of solving a perhaps even locally limited problem of knowledge and to really limit oneself to that. Application to questions. If we want to follow this view of Paul Watzlawick and for this purpose get involved in possible questions of vegan economics in the narrower and broader sense, then we no longer ask generally oriented questions like the following. How can farmers grow organic vegan in order to achieve economic returns and not go bankrupt? Or, how is managing a vegan supermarket different from managing a conventional supermarket? So we have to get away from general attempts at answers, because they are almost never possible in reality. We have to concentrate on attempts at solutions for very concrete and delimited challenges. Doesn't scientific work then always get bogged down in the details? What can I learn and take away if I am always allowed to work out the factors and criteria for only individually valid results? The answer could be: in scientific work, we do not learn solution steps that can always be repeated in terms of content, but we learn the procedures for determining possible solutions. The organic vegan farmer, who has to survive economically in the long run, is not provided with patent remedies, but has to find out the determinants of his problem thoroughly in order to find a solution that suits him. And the prospective manager of a vegan supermarket is not helped by a basic management manual, but only by the ability, trained in scientific practice, to analyze the competitive situation, the sources of supply, the target groups and their presence in a periphery to be defined, etc. We know from Paul Watzlawick that it is the task of science to develop procedures that are effective for a very specific purpose. The more and the more often we develop such procedures ourselves as offers of solutions, the better we will be trained to develop scientific solutions. So it is precisely for this that we need our own practice of scientific work again and again, as it is realized in the university environment through appropriate homework, project work and final theses. That's something. So science does not produce universally valid truths. Would you have thought that? Yes or no? Do you realize that this now also applies to your own research project? Paul Watzlawick told us, the task of science is to develop methods that are effective for a very specific purpose in each case. From this you can now deduce that you too must focus exclusively on your own purpose, on the goal of your research project in a specific case. Because generalizations based on an individual finding would be unscientific.